Hello, this is Donna Myers. This is the February 11th, 2024 Sunday school lesson for the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. And we're dealing with the book of Jonah. Last week, which we didn't record, is chapter 1. Today's chapter 2. Just to catch you up to the story, Jonah was a prophet of Israel. And God told him to go to Nineveh, a city in Assyria, who was Israel's arch enemy, to go there and to warn them of their impending doom due to their wickedness, that 40 days and they were going to be utterly destroyed if they didn't repent. And so Jonah hates the Assyrians. This is their arch enemy. And so he doesn't want to go. So he takes off in the other direction. Instead of going to Nineveh, which isn't too far away from them, he gets on a ship headed to Tarshish, which is 3,000 miles from Nineveh. Think of the United States, from New York to Los Angeles. That's how far away he is going from where God told him to go. So the ship encounters this huge storm on the way, and the sailors draw lots to see whose fault this is. They pray to their gods, they draw lots, and it falls on Jonah. And Jonah says, yeah, it's my fault. He said, I'm running from God. I'm not doing what God's telling me to do. And so he says, throw me in the sea and everything will be fine. You all will be perfectly okay. And of course, the sailors, being human beings, don't want to murder this guy by throwing him into the sea. So they try their hardest to row to shore, but they can't make it. And so they go to Jonah again, and Jonah says, throw me in the sea, just toss me overboard and you all will be fine. And so finally they pray to Jonah's God for forgiveness for this sin they are about to commit, costing another man his life. Don't let his blood be on their hands, they say. And they toss Jonah overboard. And Jonah does sink into the sea, and he is swallowed by a huge fish. The ship, in the meantime, the waters calm down and the ship is able to continue on its journey. But Jonah sits for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of this fish. So what happens next? This is where Jonah 2 picks up. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and all your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me, the deep surrounded me, weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed. I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. So we see at the start of chapter 2, Jonah about as low as he possibly can get. He's in the depths of the sea, alone in the smelly, disgusting darkness of the belly of this fish. It's here that in his lowest point that Jonah finally does what most of us do at our lowest points. He prayed. If you remember what I just told you about chapter 1, during that time period, we're not told at all of Jonah praying for anything. Jonah didn't pray. The sailors on the ship prayed. They even offered sacrifices to the Lord. But Jonah didn't pray. Not until he hit rock bottom and stayed there for 3 days. Well, think about our lives. How do we react when we hit rock bottom? Do we pray? Do we call out to God? If we haven't shown God any time, any effort when things were going well in our lives, will we have time for God when things are at their lowest? So 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of this stinking fish gave Jonah lots of time to reflect and to figure out what was going on in his life. So the first thing most of us ask is, how did I get here? How did I get in this mess? And that's what Jonah asked himself. How did he get in this mess? But the answer is not quite as simple as it may seem. Jonah got in this mess because he tried to flee from God. On the other hand, Jonah got in this mess, meaning in the belly of the fish, because God used that fish to save his life, to save him from drowning. So it's a twofold answer. So finally, Jonah does cry out to God, and God responds to him. God doesn't treat Jonah like Jonah treated him. God listens. And the next part of chapter 2 is Jonah's prayer. And you'll see 4 significant sections of Jonah's prayer. He starts with gratitude that God is responsive to his predicament. He says in verse 2, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Notice that the prayer starts with thanksgiving. Thanksgiving that the Lord heard Jonah when he cried out. There's just a slight glimmer of hope here in Jonah that God's going to take care of him. The second part of the prayer is recognition that God is responsible for his plight. He says in verse 3, you cast me into the deep. Jonah knows God is responsible for what he's going through, but this is not an accusation against God. After all, by this time, Jonah surely has figured out his part in this predicament, this mess he's gotten himself into. On the contrary, Jonah is not accusing God. He's acknowledging that God's hand has been at work in his life throughout this entire ordeal. Think about our own lives. How far away from a situation do we have to get before we see God's hand at work in that particular hard time or difficult situation? Sometimes it takes a while, sometimes years, before we can look back and say, yeah, God really was with me through all of this. God really did get me through it. But think about this. The next time God says no to you for something that you want, remember Jonah. Jonah also states that I am driven from your sight. How shall I look upon your holy temple? It's kind of ironic that Jonah, who boarded this ship to get away from God, is now grieving because he's away from God. He got what he wanted, and it's terrible. It's not really what he wants. So how far have we gotten away from God and realized it was terrible? The next time God says no to you, think of Jonah. Remember Jonah. God knows what's best. Always, if what we want isn't always what's best for us. So we have gratitude, we have recognition that God is in charge of his plight, and 3, awareness that God has purpose in his plight. God has purpose in what Jonah is going through. And verse 7 says, as my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. We have to realize that in Jonah's day, they thought God lived in the temple, and prayers had to be uttered in the temple because that's where God was. You went there to talk to God. So here Jonah is, miles and miles away, under who knows how many feet of water, deep in the sea, inside the belly of this fish. And God hears his prayer. His prayer makes it all the way to Jerusalem, to God's ears, is what Jonah's saying. And to Jonah, that's a sign. He now understands that he can't get away from God. He can't run from God. God is always there. God's presence is always with him. And finally, the 4th part of the prayer is Jonah's renewal of his commitment to God. He says in verse 9, but I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. It's sad that it took this terrible, devastating catastrophe for Jonah to realize that God was with him and that he needed to obey God. It's a shame that it took this terrible situation to change Jonah's attitude. But inside the belly of this fish, everything suddenly looks different. He didn't need to be upset. He needed to be grateful. Jonah realizes that he didn't need to run away from God. He needed to see God working in his life. He didn't need to curse God. He needed to pray to God. He didn't need to speak with a voice of fear or anger toward God. He needed to speak with a voice of thanksgiving. This Jonah in chapter 2 is way different than the Jonah we saw in chapter 1. This Jonah is grateful to still be alive, and he's thanking God for saving him. It's amazing what a little time in the dark belly of a fish can do for one's attitude. Have you ever had an experience that has drastically changed your attitude in a positive way? So we have to ask ourselves, is Jonah's change of heart real? Is this just lip service to get him out of this terrible situation he's in? Will God declare Jonah an incorrigible sinner and move on to someone more obedient? Or will God give him a second chance? The answer comes in verse 10. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land. Part of me wants to stop right here and leave you with this cliffhanger to find out what happens to Jonah next. But I know this is a familiar story. Most of you already know how it ends. So let's read on to chapter 3, the first verse, just to get us over the hump of what happens. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time." God not only rescued Jonah from the whale, he also gave Jonah a second chance. So look at things from God's point of view. What's God thinking here? Jonah's a proven loser, a failed follower. There must be better missionary candidates out there somewhere. But God still seeks Jonah. He still believes in Jonah, and he still wants him to go to Nineveh. The witness of Jonah 2 is clear and inspiring. Even at our lowest point, God is with us. There's no depth where God can't hear our cries for help. God is a God of second chances. Now, there are two truths that they expect us to glean from this story. First, it is that God is always with us, obviously. Through all the ups and downs in our lives, we serve a God who remains always within earshot of our prayers. God hears our prayers when we hurl them in the midst of a terrible crisis or when we softly whisper them in solitude. God doesn't leave us to endure the storms of life alone, even when they're storms of our own making. In our laughter and rest, God is with us. In our overwhelming depths of despair, God is with us, listening, welcoming, inviting us to join him in his unfolding mission in our world. Even when we run away from God, God's always with us. I find this very comforting. I find this very reassuring. The second lesson, truth we need to glean from this, is that faith in God is a dynamic adventure. The first two chapters of Jonah, we find a character and a narrative that's on the move. Jonah resisted God, endured great calamity, and finally reflects on and repents from his mistakes. He emerged from his crisis offering praise to God for his steadfast faithfulness. God is faithful. But think, where's God in this story? Where was God when Jonah sank to his lowest point? He was there, always, listening, caring for Jonah. And God is there in your adventure of faith too. He's always there beside you, listening, willing to be the God he is if you will only let him. James Nagowski aptly observes that foxhole confessions, which is kind of what Jonah experienced here, are only as real as the follow-through, he says. Jonah's prayer has all the elements of a stirring moment of conversion. But has the prophet really seen the light? Has he really changed? Or once he gets out of that whale, is he going to go back to his old ways? What he does next will reveal the truth. And the same is true for us. We can pray impressive prayers in our moments of distress, but the authenticity of our faith is clearly seen in how we behave when the danger's over. Stay tuned to next week so you can find out if Jonah is for real. Thank you.